The following lecture will cover the first two chapters of Werner, Human Resource Development. Now, disclaimer, this lecture will not cover every topic and every slide of the presentations. I'm trying to cover over 100 slides here, so I'm going to be very judicious. I'm going to talk about things that I feel like need a little illumination, or perhaps I can bring some personal insight to this topic that might help clarify. So, hang on to your hats. We're going to go pretty quickly through these slides here. My encouragement would be to thoroughly read the textbook and then review all of the slides that are available to you in Canvas as well, and then to watch this, and it might add a few additional little tidbits of understanding. Here's the definition of HRD: a set of systematic and planned activities designed by an organization to provide its members with the opportunities to learn necessary skills and meet future and current job demands. And so you see that learning is at the core of HRD, right? So in order for humans to develop, there needs to be some cognitive growth, some emotional growth, some skills growth, and that's how they can apply these things in their work context to make their job, to do their job more proficiently. And so I love this topic because, as I mentioned in our intro, it's a great intersection of organizational behavior, which is humans' interaction with the organization and with each other in a work context, and learning, right? So as an educator, obviously this is important to me. So this topic brings together a couple of very important fields. Of course, HRD doesn't begin with the first training. It begins when the employee joins the organization. So the very first HRD activities happen during orientation, and they should continue on throughout one's employment and be responsive to changes, demands in the job, changes in the organization, changes in the industry. And of course, it must reflect corporate goals and strategy. And this is a big deal in HRD, right? Because a lot of times an organization will change its strategy, and people need to change and grow in order to implement that strategy. So HRD really is connected with overall changes in the workplace, functions, new directions, etc., etc. Now, this section of the text gives you a little bit of development and background on HRD. It wasn't always this sophisticated. It started off through things like apprenticeships and yeomen and masters and guilds and those sorts of things. But that's an interesting way to think about the overall development of the field. This isn't a brand new thing. It's been something that's been going on for quite a long time, obviously, more recently formalized in the field of HRD. Now, the human relations movement is an important turning point in the field of management. Prior to this, it was the running theme, the running conceptualization was what's called scientific management. And so scientific management was this idea that we can maximize production by dictating every responsibility, every nuance of somebody's job. You know, how long it should take them to dig a ditch, and how long should the shovel be, and but the human relations movement recognized that people work better and are more productive when they are considered, when their needs are considered, when their skills and their motivation are considered. And so the whole human relations movement really changed, was kind of a sea change in the way corporations viewed individuals, not just as cogs and machines, but as people who they could get more production if they took their feelings, their dispositions, their personalities, all these things into consideration. And so HRD has expanded. The ASTD, American Society for Training and Development, expanded. I believe they changed their name, but that was sort of a seminal turning point in HRD as a field of professional field. Now, the HRD is part of the overall human resource management field, and so HRM has more to do. It has a larger scope, so HRD is a part of HRM, and I think this chart here sort of shows where it sort of fits in there, right? So you've got HR management in general, but then you've got the HRD director down there, right? Parallel with things like compensation, benefits, staffing director, and those sorts of things. So you'll see the primary functions of HRM include things like obtaining, maintaining, and developing employees, right? And then some of the specific things are things like planning, equal employment opportunities, staffing, compensation, benefits. So some of you might say, well, I like to work with people, but I really don't like all the paperwork of benefits and all that. Well, this might be a good place for you because it really has to do with that development and training and helping people on their job performance side. It's not the compensation, benefits, payroll that a lot of people associate with HR functions in a corporation. Some primary HRD functions: training and development, organizational development, and career development. Now, I had mentioned organizational behavior earlier. Organizational development is a similar field. It has to do with understanding organizational sciences and social sciences and helping to change the organization by changing people and developing different ways of approaching their functioning. And so training and development is an important part, a companion piece to OD. And we'll talk more about OD later on in this class. Here's some specific training and development activities that are common. As I mentioned, employee orientation. That's the very first training and development activity that an employee is going to go through. Skills training, so specific things that they need to know how to do, depending on where they are in the organization. And typically, skills training, when you think about structure, is going to be more for frontline employees, right? So people that are actually meeting one-on-one, face-to-face with the end user of the product. So in a service industry, these will be customer service people. These might be sales people. In more of a product base, these might be people that are involved in the development of the production of goods, manufacturing areas. And as you move up in the organization, that's when you focus more on things like coaching, counseling, executive development, leadership development, right? Because leaders are not developed in the same way as frontline workers. So they don't need hands-on skill training. They need larger cognitive complexity things, emotional intelligence, analytical skills, strategic skills, right? Capitalizing on their strengths, those sorts of things, right? So you kind of have to look at training and development differently in different areas of the organization. Now, I mentioned earlier organizational development, but here's a good definition. The process of enhancing the effectiveness of an organization and its employees through planned interventions that apply behavioral science concepts. So you can look at it the macro level, which affects the entire organization, and then the micro, which might change individuals or small groups and teams, right? So there's different levels of OD interventions. So in OD, the HRD professional works as a change agent to facilitate the change process. So OD often has to do with change, large-scale change, and so this is where HRD professionals help in that by becoming a change agent. And then there's things like career development, and then the performance wheel, the new learning and performance wheel shows all the different aspects of HRD and the different competencies that are involved in a typical organization. And what you'll notice here, what is salient to me in this slide here is that business strategy is the hub of everything, right? So there's an old maxiom that structure follows strategy, right? I think that was Chandler that said that. And what does that mean? It means that strategy drives everything. And so sometimes when you hear people say things, well, we don't do it that way around here. We've tried that before. We can't do it. Those those need to be challenged, because if the strategy changes, then you need to try new approaches. You must make the changes. And so strategy is at the center of everything, including your performance management and your HR development. Now, I mentioned earlier about the connection between HR to strategic management, but we must assess viability of current missions, objectives, strategies, etc., monitor and assess external environment for threats and opportunities, and identify strategic factors that need to be changed. Okay, so that's strategic management in a nutshell. So the challenge then is the alignment of the organization with the strategy, right? So for example, we might say the field has changed. Everything, let's just say you're in the publication industry, right? Well, once upon a time, writers would come back to their offices and crank up their typewriters or crank up their computers, and they'd write an article, and it was sent over to an editor, and then it was sent out to the press, and they would press it, and they would print it and distribute it, right? Well, we all know that the digital age has vastly impacted how publication happens now, right? So now it's not just about writing and producing content for a written publication, but it's how do we go digital, right? So your whole marketing team, your whole writing team, your whole production team has to change their mindset to make the publication industry now, accessible in the digital age. And it's taken a while for industry to catch up with this, but this is kind of a sea change in a particular sector that really required a lot of alignment of practices and structure, even departments, with a new strategy and a new approach, because the industry changed right under their noses. Now, here's a good overview of the HRD executive, right? Formerly was called something like the training director, sometimes the chief learning officer. I've still heard that term, actually, the CLO. I like that, chief learning officer, but it's often called HRD manager. It integrates HRD with goals and strategy of the organization. Now, it's important for this to be kind of a high-level position, right? Because if you don't have a seat at the table, if you don't have input into management decisions, you're not going to be, much of a change agent, right? So it's typically somebody needs to be involved at an executive level in order to incorporate the ideas for training and development that are necessary to keep up with the organizational strategy. So you'll see it assumes a leadership role in executive development, and it promotes the value of HRD functions. And this is a big challenge, right? Because you got a lot of old timers and hardliners. People say, well, why do we need to change? We've been doing it this way for 40 years. Yeah, and our revenue has been slipping over the last 5 years. So, we need a wake-up call. We need to change our people approach. We need to retrain our people, whatever it takes in order to align our organizational capacity with the new demands, right? So having a leadership voice and executive level position here is going to be crucial in order for a successful HRD manager. Let me camp on this one a little bit here. Now, one of the roles here has to do with organizational design consultant. Now, you might be saying, what's organizational design? Now, this is a sophisticated idea here, but there's been a lot written on this. Over time, organizations kind of evolve. And, think of the city of Rome. It started off with the center, and buildings were added, and roads were added, and communities were added. And if you look at a flyover map of Rome, it just looks like this big, organic hodgepodge of cities and streets. There was not a whole lot of design other than adding as needed. Well, that's how a lot of organizations look. It starts off with a small team, and then departments are added, and eventually it just becomes a big, complex web of people, and it's not all that effective. It doesn't function that effectively. So, from time to time, especially during large strategic changes, organizations need to go through what's called organizational design or redesign. This could involve downsizing. It could involve, reassigning people. It could involve bringing in new people in order to accomplish new things, like in that example I mentioned earlier, digital publication. And so organizational design has to do with realigning people and structures and processes to effectively meet the new organizational challenges. So I won't go through all these different roles here, but perhaps some of you are reading through some of these and saying, I like these ideas. I like the idea of being a career counselor or an instructor facilitator or learning program specialist, OD consultant, organizational change, right? So these are all exciting potential roles for somebody in an organization. If you like working with people, especially if you like education, again, a guy like me, this is appealing because I'm a teacher at heart, and I love the idea of teaching in an organizational context. So you might be saying, I didn't even know that was a job. You could be a potential HRD professional in the future. And again, I mentioned the ATSD. There's certifications, options, and education available for HRD professionals, like many fields, most fields. There's ongoing professional training and certification. So if you're interested in this field as a profession, I would encourage you to look into the ASTD and consider their certification program. Now, there are some trends here that are changing this whole field, right? Uncertain economic conditions, blurred lines of life and work, the shrinking world through global communication, work must be nimble, quick, security, etc., and ethical issues as well. So 6 challenges for HRD currently are this global economy, skills gap, workforce diversity, meeting the need for lifelong learning, facilitating organizational learning, and addressing ethics. These are all kind of current challenges that face us in the workplace. Now, we'll get more into this later, but here's your basic framework for HRD. First, you assess the need, what skills training is needed, design the training, whether it's coaching, whether it's a class, whether it's a series of classes, whether it's an electronic learning platform, an e-class like the one you're taking here. Implement it, and then come back and evaluate it, right? So did the students learn what we wanted them to learn? Did the change happen, right? So this is kind of a cycle, and you evaluate, and then you do it again, and you can change the training, update it, make it more effective. So here again in chart form is the sort of the planning, assessment, assessment, design, implementation, evaluation phase sequence. And this goes through all of the specific aspects of this. I won't go through this, but this is important because this is a very foundational concept of what one needs to do in education, is assess the needs, design your objectives and your lessons and your materials, who's going to do the training, scheduling, implement the training, deliver as you design, and then evaluate. Come back and test people, look at determine the impact on the bottom line, right? So this is a big one in corporate America, right? It's called return on investment. So if an organization is going to invest, lots of money in hiring you as their HRD professional, and the opportunity cost of sending people to these courses or whatever training, right, and the facilities, it costs a lot of money to do all this stuff. They want to see that there's a return on investment. So you have to be able to demonstrate that the training actually impacts the bottom line. So there's a lot of ways to do that. We'll get into that more later on in the class, but that's an important thing for you to understand, that they're not just doing it for fun, give you a job, but rather to impact the bottom line. Now, let's go through the next chapter here. We already talked about some of the goals of HRD: to assist employees and organizations in attaining their goals, The ultimate objective is to improve organizational performance. And so the major focus of HRD interventions is an effort to change employee behavior. And again, this is front lines, skill level, at the higher levels, management, leadership, executive levels, training has a little bit of a different focus. It is focused more on cognitive complexity, analytical skills, personal development, etc., etc. But a lot of the frontline HRD interventions are about employee behavior. So here's a good model of employee behavior. And we're going to talk about many of these things in this particular chapter here, right? So you've got your external environment and you've got the internal world, of the organization itself. So, external forces that affect behavior are things outside of the organization, like the general state of the economy, and inside of the work environment has to do with the leadership, one's coworkers, like the culture and the climate of the organization itself impacts employees. For example, a supervisor or manager who doesn't have very good people skills, or he or she has this demotivational impact on people. That's a force upon people's behavior, right? If they have a boss, let's just make it real simple here. If you have a boss you don't like, that's going to impact your performance, right? You might not work very hard. You might spend all your time, surfing the web, looking for other jobs, or daydreaming, or slacking off on your job, taking too many micro breaks, whatever it's called now. But that's a force on people's behavior, right? And then there's the internal forces, right? So within the employee, things like motivation, knowledge, skills, and abilities. That's what KSA stands for, in case you're wondering. We're going to talk about those later on in this chapter here. Okay, so we talked about these external influences like the general economy, government intrusion, global technology issues. In spite of excellent work and production, external influence can result in downsizing. And I believe the textbook talks a little bit about the research, the impact of downsizing. But this happens though, economies expand and they contract. And so you can go through a season of growth, but then things contract and all of a sudden you got to downsize, which typically means in most organizations you cut a lot of jobs. And that has an impact on the people left behind, right? The survivors of the downsizing. They feel guilty, they feel bad, they've lost their friends, they're worried about whether they're next, right? So there's a lot of influences upon people's behavior in the workforce. And so organizations invest a lot of time and money in the workforce, and they must maintain that investment even when restructuring. Now, this next section here gets into theories of motivation. I won't try to teach all those here in a whirlwind fashion, but it's important for you to learn these things, things like expectancy theory, equity theory, self-fulfilling prophecy, the role of leadership, the difference between leadership and management. Now, this is something you'll learn in OB or your leadership courses, but leadership isn't about the, hands-on ability to coerce people to get them to do things, right? It's really that non-coercive influence to direct and coordinate the activities of a group towards accomplishing a goal. Now, leadership is a whole field in itself. We're going to do an entire class on that. You're going to take a whole class on that at the university here. So I'm not going to try to unpack it in this one slide here, but these are influences on people. Now, you might notice it says non-coercive. Well, sometimes it becomes coercive, right? And it's no longer leadership. It becomes a different influence on people. The reward structure is very influential on people, right? Did people get the rewards? Are they rewarded for their performance? Can they connect the rewards with their actual performance, or are rewards just handed out, kind of nilly-willy in a way that doesn't make sense? And that can demotivate people too, right? So just keep in mind that rewards are more than money or plaques. They can include recognition and acceptance. And as you go through theories of motivation, especially Herzberg, you're going to recognize there's different categories, right? So money is one kind of reward and influencer, but recognition, accomplishment, opportunities for advancement, all those things, those are other strong rewards and motivators in an organization. So organizational culture is also very important, right? This is the set of values, beliefs, norms, and patterns of behavior that are shared by organization members that guide their behavior. And again, this is more in the field of organizational behavior, but it's important to understand culture because it has a strong influence on how people behave. That's what we're talking about in this chapter. Group dynamics is another important influencer on people's behavior. Things like groupthink, concerned with the unanimity rather than making good decisions. So people don't want to challenge the status quo, they want to get along and they want to conform, right? And so that has a strong influence. So if you have a really strong, cohesive group, sometimes team members are reticent to say anything that will go against the group, make them stand out because they don't want to, quote unquote, rock the boat. And then social loafing, right? This happens when people are unmotivated or disinterested. And then motivation. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit more about motivation. Again, this is a big field in OB. It's based on the individual because of unique needs, desires, attitudes, and goals, right? So because everybody's different, motivation is going to work a little bit differently for different people. However, there are some general theories of motivation that are true for most people. So motivation can be broken down into different categories here. What they call the needs-based approach, which includes Maslow, Alderfer, Herzberg, which I mentioned earlier, and then cognitive approach, process approach, for example, expectancy theory, goal setting theory, social learning theory, and equity theory. Okay, so again, I'm not going to be able to teach all of that here. Go through the chapter, and then there's a good exercise for you to discuss which of those theories helps you understand your own motivation. Now, social learning theory is kind of an interesting one, and this is put forth by a guy named Bandura. It doesn't mention his name here, but in the text it talks about, I believe, Albert Bandura. But the main thing to understand about social learning theory, from my point of view, is that people learn by watching other people. And so in an organizational context, people will learn what's normal, what's expected, what's accepted, what's not accepted by watching other people. So this is important if you're a manager or supervisor because people are watching you for cues about what's okay. So if you come in late, if you leave early, if you take paper clips, if you do all these kind of things, guess what? That's what other people are going to think is okay. On the other hand, if you work hard, if you're ethical, if you report issues, if you treat people well, that is what other people are going to do as well. So social learning theory is kind of the underpinning idea that helps us understand that you can have all the training in the world, but if your culture goes against that training, people are going to be disenchanted. They're going to see it's disingenuous or window dressing, right? We have this great corporate statement about our values and our ethics, yet, man, every day I just see people doing things wrong and nobody says anything, right? That's a very bad, toxic situation, right? So you always want to align the behavior and the culture with the stated values and aspirations of the organization. Equity theory, this is a good one here. I'm going to just say a little something about this one here. So this idea that motivation is strongly influenced by people's desire to be treated fairly and perceptions about whether they have been treated fairly, right? So let's just give an example. Say you have the same degree as a coworker, you've been on the job as long as a coworker, your performance is just as good as a coworker, but she gets a raise and you don't. Well, equity theory would say now you feel that's unjust, right? And so there's a lot of ways that you can respond to that. You can reduce your performance or outputs. You can work against the system, right? Countervailing structures, or you can leave. right? Or you can go postal. I mean, there's a lot of things that happen when people feel like they're treated unfairly. So to me, equity theory is an important way to understand. And I think it really helps managers understand that you need to be above board with your processes, right? You need to treat people fairly and equitably. People need to know what the rules are, and it's not one rule for one set of people and another rule for another set of people. This is a challenge of smaller growing organizations, is that they don't really have policies and consistent approaches to things, and so it's a bit ad hoc, and managers do things as best as they can, but at the end of the day people perceive these things as unfair. So as organizations grow, they have to work to make their processes and systems equitable and above board and transparent, so people know what the heck's going on. Then there's a section here on behavior modification. This is kind of important in HRD, right? Because what we're trying to do is change people's behavior. And so behavior modification talks about things like positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, extinction, punishment, right? So some of this language might be familiar to you from your psych class, right? And so think about, Pavlov's dog, right? Pavlov's dog was given a treat every time the bell rang, and he would salivate. And so after a while, just ringing the bell would make the dog salivate because he thought he was getting the treat. And so now one behavior was extinct, but it was still the what do you call it? The reaction was still there, right? And so behavior modification in the workplace, we don't ring bells and hand out treats, but we're using the same principles of letting people know that there's rewards and there's punishments for certain behaviors, right? And so if people work hard and they get rewarded, what are they likely to do next time? That's right, work hard. Or if people don't work hard and they're punished, they'll either change their behavior or they'll go somewhere else where they don't have to work as hard, right? So you have to decide as a manager how do you incentivize things, because that's to a large degree going to, influences people's behavior because of the reinforcement effect that these kind of rewards have. And there's a section here on attitudes, all important stuff. So I know this was kind of a whirlwind tour here, but hopefully this helped. If you have any questions, just let me know. So blessings to you all, and I'll see you online.